this lesson, we're going to create a very basic application. We're going to use a VBCS feature called Quick Starts to quickly generate lots of UI. Then we'll spend a fair amount of time digging into what was created so we can understand how a VBCS app works. So here's the app that we're going to be creating. It's a simple expense report app that tracks expense reports. I can see my list of expense reports. I can create a new expense report, and I can edit the details of any existing expense report. So before we build this app in VBCS, let's think about how we would code this application if we were coding it by hand. So if I was coding this by hand, I would probably break out an HTML editor, right? And I'd put a bunch of components in it, right? So I'd break out an editor, I'd make this HTML page, and I'd add a bunch of components like a list view and some buttons and so forth, right? And then I'd want to have a data model for this application. So I'd have some JavaScript variables. And here I would hold all the state, like I'd have a variable for my list of applications. It would be some sort of array, and I might have a variable for the selected application and so forth. Right? So I'd have my variables. And then I'd have data that I would be pushing into that client-side model, right? Usually through REST services. So I would make some AJAX call to some REST service. I would have some authentication around that REST service. I'd get a response back. I'd map that response, that JSON response, into my local variables, which would then get bound to my UI and displayed in these components. And finally, I'd have some events that would trigger some sort of client-side logic. So for example, on this page, I may have an event that when the page is loaded, go call a REST API and fetch the data for this list. Or an event where if I select something, a button gets enabled. Or when a button gets clicked, you navigate to a page and call the REST API for that page, and so forth.
So the important thing to understand is that all of those things that we said how we would build this from scratch, this is exactly how VBCS builds an app. We just provide you declarative ways to define all these things. So if you go and you look at an app, and here's my empty app that we're going to start creating, and I look at a page of here, so I'll have my components, right? So here's all my components on the side, which I can drop into my HTML page. I'll have some variables, right? So here's my variables, and I've got types that I can define so the variables can be of a type, and that way VBCS knows how to deal with those things. And then what else? We have the actions, right? So I'll have my actions and my settings that launch those actions, right? And then we had REST services that go back down to some sort of database, right? And the REST services in our case are the business objects themselves, right? And the business objects all expose their endpoints. But if we were to bring in service connections like Fusion Applications or Twitter or whatever, then we would see those here too, right? Okay, so now that we've kind of gone over the basic philosophy of building an app, let's go ahead and build one. So I'm going to close this to get a little bit more real estate. And we're going to drag a list into here. And I have these quick starts. Here's the property inspector, right? Whatever I've selected, properties will show up here. And then I have a quick start, this tab in the end, which is the quick starts. And I can click add data. And I'll need to select the get many endpoint for this, and I'm going to select get expense reports. Right, that's going to return all expense reports. I can select a template. I'm going to go with a custom template here. And then for fields, let's bring in name. Let's bring in maybe amount. Let's bring in start date, end date, and which country it was. Now you'll see here I have the field itself. This is a reference to my country business object. And if I drop this in here, what I'll get is I'll just get the index of the record that I'm looking for in the country database, right? What I want to do is I have this country object that actually exposes what's the fields that are in that related object, and so I can come in and bring in the name from there. Okay, so name, amount, start date, end date, and the country. That looks good to me. Let's click next. Here, if I wanted to, I could define any query parameters and so forth. I'm going to just skip that and click finish. So here we go. I now have my list, which is showing my data, and I can now go in and add a create page. So it asked me which endpoint I wanted to choose, and so I'll choose the post endpoint on expense report, and I'm going to choose my things here. So I want my amount, my country, let's see, my end date, get the description, justification, start date, and the name. Okay. I like to just have my buttons say create, and we want to fix this up to use the display name. Okay, and now I can click finish. And now I can see that I've added my create button. I can switch into live mode and click that to navigate to it. And there's my page. We'll come back and fix this up in a second. Right, but first let's go ahead and add an edit page as well. So which endpoint am I going to call to get the existing record? I'm going to call the get on expense report and then the ID. Which endpoint am I going to call to update it, to save my changes? I'm going to call on the patch. All right. Okay, and again here I'm going to use the same things here: description, end date, justification, name, and start date. Again, I like edit and fix the name and finish. Okay, and there's my edit page as well. Okay, so let's go back and take a look for a second at this. So what have we created with these quick starts? Well, first thing we've created are components, and as you can see, it dropped a bunch of components in here. But an interesting thing to note here is that while I can work with these guys declaratively, like for example, probably want to change this to country. And there we go. So I can work with this declaratively just by hitting events in the property inspector, but I can also switch into code mode, and I can make any edits I want in here. All right, so let's say I just want to make this actually be, say I don't want the name on there, and I want to make this an H3. If I come back to the code, it did it for me. Okay, so I can go back and forth between the code editor and the declarative editor. So what else did it do? Let's take a look. So let's select the list, and in the data tab, let's see what this is bound to. So this is bound to a service data provider. Now, a service data provider is a JET construct. It's basically an array on steroids. It's an array that has a lot of additional capabilities, and one of those capabilities is that it knows that it's bound to a REST API, right? And here we can see which endpoint it's bound to. So whenever the component that this array is bound to gets rendered, it goes out, calls the REST API, and stores a response without you having to write any code. It also specifies a type, right? And we see that this is of type get all expense report. And so the type defines the shape of the variable and makes sure it matches what the REST endpoints are expecting in their payloads, right? And the quick starts generate these types at the flow level. So if I click the flows, come in here in the types, this is where we see all the types that were generated, okay? So what else did the quick starts create? They created some actions. So if we go to the events, we can see the events that we've set up to listen to selection change in the list, and to also handle the button clicks. And each event specifies an action chain. So let's check out the navigate to edit action chain. And this is a pretty simple action chain. It's, you have a start, you've got just one action, which is navigate to page, says which page to navigate to. And since this page has a mandatory input parameter called expense report ID, then our navigate to page actually maps that in, and it passes our page variable that stores a selected ID in as the path parameter. The edit page is a lot more interesting. Let's close this to get some more screen. Okay, so the edit page has an input event, a VB enter event. So when this page is entered or when it's loaded, it calls the load expense report chain. And this action chain goes out and it starts and it calls the REST API and it passes in as the path parameter our page variable, the ID, right? And then if that succeeds, it is going to assign this back to, it's going to assign the results of this, the body, back to our page variable, which is expense report record. So let's take a look at that. So our expense report record is of type update expense report request. So that means that its shape matches exactly the payload structure that's expected by the Patch API. In VBCS objects, as with most Oracle SaaS APIs, the read payload and the update payload are identical. So now we can clean up our page a little bit. So first of all, both this description and the justification, we want to change those from simple text fields to text areas. So we'll drop in a couple of text areas. We'll change the text to description and justification. And we combine them in here. And we've got this handy picker here that shows all of the variables in the page, and we can use it to bind. All display fields take expressions, so that means that we can come in here and do something like this, and then do something like that. So that way we can show the ID in the title, but this just goes to show that you can use expressions anywhere in the display text or really in any of these properties. What else can we do? Let's take this amount here, and this is currently just being shown as a regular number. Let's bring that in as a currency instead. And we'll bind it. Okay. And now let's just reorder things a little bit. I'm going to put, say, name up at the top. There we go. Now we can just reorder a couple of these guys. Bring this over here. Bring this down there. And the last thing we're going to do is select the entire form layout and bump this up to 2 columns. Let's hide that. And there we go. And we'll do the same thing for the create expense report, and our app is ready to go.